Hello, everybody, and welcome. We have a video that I find really exciting to do every month, and I hope you enjoy it too, because this is where we take a look back at our eBay listings for the prior month and see how they did. Every month we put 20 items up on eBay auctions. Sometimes they're valuable, sometimes they just have an interesting story, but they're things we think will attract people's attention, and some of the people are repeat buyers, and some of the people are new folks who have never seen us before. We start out by giving early access to our level 2 and 3 members and thank them very much for the support that they give that makes this possible. But then we roll it out so the entire world has a chance during what is generally a 7 to 10 day auction, sometimes with a buy it now, sometimes not. And the reason we do it that way is because we like to have a snapshot of what's going on in the marketplace for these particular items at a particular moment in time. So without further ado, let's take a look and see how we did last month and see what we can learn from our sales in May of 2023. The first item we sold is this very beautiful Romeo and Juliet retired piece here. And there we go. We'll put the front up so you can see them. This is a Lladró statue, and it is really wonderful porcelain. And the fact that it's retired and the fact that it's large and very detailed, there's lots of things that can go wrong. Little fingers that can break off. The end of the sword is often missing. So we really needed to be careful with this one. The back has such nice detail too, with all the grape leaves and everything on it. And so this one was the first item to sell. It actually went for $300, which was our buy it now price. So one person just really loved it and bought it right away. I was pleasantly surprised by that. I know that Lladró, and especially the retired pieces, are definitely still in good demand. But this was the large piece. It was 16 pounds. It was pretty big to ship. We shipped it by FedEx, and it made it there intact. We learned a valuable lesson last month with a big heavy item that we shipped to UPS, and they drove a forklift truck through it, and that was the end of it. So trying to avoid using UPS whenever possible after that experience. This one made it to its new destination, and the new owner was very happy with it, and I was very happy to see that it went for the price it should have on the buy it now. I had a few problems last month, I've got to tell you. There were a few things where I made a critical mistake, and this was one of them. I took my client who gave me this piece to sell's word for what it was instead of doing my own research. That is a rookie mistake. Immediately it was called out by people on eBay saying that is not a Hopi Kachina. First of all, the Hopi do not do the pieces with the big fur, and the Navajo pieces are not really based on the effigies because it's not part of their culture. They just saw that the Hopi were selling them well, thought it would be cool to make dancers, and so they did this guy who is called Buffalo. Once I understood that, I took down the listing, I put it back up with the proper information, and it immediately sold at the buy it now price of $95, which is a fair price for what it was, but it just tells you how critical it is to do your own research and not rely on what other people tell you. The client said that he bought it himself on the reservation, and I just took his word for it. It turns out that he must have been across the line because the Hopi and the Navajo live right next to each other. In fact, the Navajo reservation essentially surrounds a lot of the Hopi reservation. So I think he just didn't know where he was. And so I learned a valuable lesson too, but it's a really cool figure. They do really elaborate work. The hand painting is fun, and that's why people are collecting these now. This one is Buffalo. Largo is a Navajo artist, and I really appreciate being schooled because this is how I learned too. So I was very grateful that someone on eBay was willing to tell me exactly what it was and straighten that out so that I could relist it properly, and proper information brings proper sales. So it sold for the right amount to somebody who understood what it was and really liked it, and I was very happy for that. This also sold right away at a buy it now, and I got a kick out of it because I loved this show when I was a little kid. And speaking of Native Americans, Randolph Mantooth, the fellow on the upper left there, he was one of the first famous Native American actors. And so there's a little strange connection there somehow. I thought this was a great show when I was a kid, and it actually was an instrumental show because Los Angeles had just gotten EMTs allowed. It used to be that the ambulance drivers couldn't do anything much, they just had to take you to the hospital, and it dawned on people that maybe if the medical responders had more training and could do more, they might be able to save more lives and help more people. And emergency popularized the idea, and pretty soon EMTs were commonplace throughout the country and have been ever since. So it actually was a pretty critical show in that regard. It sold for $19. That's a pretty typical selling price for these. That's why I put it at that for the buy it now. And it went to somebody else who also loved that show. So that made me happy. Now, this piece is a very hard to find piece, and this is the first of the ones. The rest of these all made it through the entire auction process, and these were the high bids. This one is Medalta Pottery. Medalta stands for Medicine Hat, Alberta, and they had a couple of different, because they have gas wells there, they had a couple of different ceramic and glass companies. Alta Glass was made there. There was another ceramic pottery company in Medicine Hat besides Medalta, but Medalta was a big deal for a long time, and they were the first Canadian company to start selling in Eastern Canada goods that were made, housewares that were made in Western Canada. That was a first at that time. Usually Eastern Canada got their housewares from England or from East Coast Eastern Canadian or East Coast United States companies, and Medalta actually established that, no, we're going to sell a Canadian brand to Canadians cross-country. So they were a big deal for quite a while. I've actually toured what's left of the factory. They still have the kilns there. They still do a little small batch production there, so you can buy things while you're there. I have a little piece I got there. This is Winston Churchill, and this is right after he made his very inspirational speech about the notion that there will always be an England, that we will not fail in our fight to keep the Nazis out of England. And it turned out to be true. So this was made about 1940. A pretty hard piece to find. You see Churchill written on the side there. And so this one went for $76 on 2 bids. I thought that was a pretty fair price. I thought it would go for somewhere between $75 and $100. You just never see these. Our next piece here, the Swarovski crown, the frog prince with the crown. This one sold for $22.50 on 12 bids. A pretty reasonable price for Swarovski crystal, but not a bad price for this particular piece, especially because it was so little that it was hard to take a good picture. Usually I can isolate the background, and it just couldn't be done on this, and so it certainly looked a lot better when the person opened the box than it did in the picture. But you can see here, because it looks very yellowed in the knees, and that was just a lighting trick. I just couldn't get better pictures, and that really does hurt you on eBay. So the fact that I was able to get a decent price without, but the reason I put it on, the thing I thought was interesting is in this picture, notice this block. I wanted people to see this because this S with the copyright is the Swarovski mark before about 1980. So many people are used to seeing the swans, and I actually got this at an estate sale where everything with the swan was priced really high and everything without a swan was priced really low, even though the stuff with the S was the older Swarovski, because they did not recognize the mark. So that's a little tip that you folks might be able to use out there if you are shopping for these as a collector or a reseller. This next piece, there are a couple of fun things with this one. This came from Greece, of course, and was made originally around 1910. It's a little box made quite a lot like a firkin, where it's the straps that are attached around the side to make the sides of the box. And this was at a time, as you see, they made sure they told us on this tag that somebody left with it. In the old days, a lesbian was simply an inhabitant of the Isle of Lesbos, where the dates were grown. And this rare item, well, rare, scarce, we'll give it that, which held dates from that island, well, that's what this was made to be. It came out of a collection where the folks had a A lot of things that had double entendres on them. I had sold one a couple of months ago, and the same collector came back and spotted this piece, and it went to them. Well, I should say it should have gone to them. I had a few problems last month. I actually somehow wrote the wrong piece on the wrong box and put the wrong label on the wrong box. And so this and a piece that we're going to see shortly went to the wrong people, which was very embarrassing, and I refunded both of their shipping and asked them if they would please send back to each other, because they were both anxious to get the thing they actually paid for, and they were willing to do that, and I felt confident in the situation, and they both eventually got their stuff. So note to self, in the future I am not going to write the name of the item on the box. I'm going to write the name of the recipient on the box so that I make sure that label goes with the right piece. In any event, it sold for a good price. It had 12 bids and ended up at $92 because it's an interesting scarcity. This piece had 2 bids and went to a friend of mine who is a tobacco salesperson, and so it was kind of perfect for this person. It's Chew Lorillard Splendid Plug Tobacco. We know it's from the 1910s. It's a poker chip. Lorillard was one of the companies that was broken out of, I believe it was American Brands Tobacco, that was one of the big trusts that was busted up during the era of the trust busters when the monopolies were just getting too huge. Boy, we could use a little of that again today. In the meantime, the Lorillard company ended up being its own company, and Splendid Plug Tobacco was one of the very first things that they made. So this is a poker chip in celluloid. It's double-sided. It went for $11.61, and that's a pretty decent price for an interesting advertising poker chip from that era. Some poker chips can be really, really valuable, and it's not just recent stuff that's got a big denomination on it. Some of the old poker chips can really be spendy if they're interesting and scarce. And this one I thought was pretty cool. Now this piece, I just love the color. And again, I knew some of what I needed to know when I listed this, and I made a few mistakes as well. I knew correctly, and I'll show you, that the acid mark on the bottom of the Blenko piece, which will come in here, you can see it here a little bit. It's a little fuzzy, BL, and then you can't really see ENK, and you get a little bit of an O. The acid mark was only used from 1958 to 1961 for exactly that reason. It was very hard to apply. They sandblasted it. I call it an acid mark, and that's really a misnomer because it was not an acid etch. It was actually sandblasted. It didn't take well. It tended to be broken up by the pontil. The bottoms would be a little bit curved. It was uneven. And so after a few years, they went back to putting the foil paper label on. They were trying to put a permanent mark on the bottom that would be something that would help bring people back to Blenko to shop, but it just didn't work for them. Years and years later, when I suggested Pilgrim Glass do the same thing, their answer was to actually get a tool that embossed and pressed in the mark into the bottom of the glass. And that was how they got around it. The other mistake I made with this piece was actually made in the 1930s. I knew that this particular one was done during Wayne Husted's time as a designer, and I did not realize because there are a series of Blenko books by Leslie Pina that are basically catalog reprints that are worth getting if you're a Blenko collector. But there was an earlier book that covered the 1930 to 1953 era with their first designer, in-house designer Winslow Anderson, and various pieces designed by the staff before he came to Blenko Glass. And this particular piece turns out to be one that was designed by the staff in 1937, when they'd only been making this sort of ware for about 6 or 7 years. This was something they came up with in-house, and it stayed in the line for many, many years. So I misidentified it as a sky blue because that was a 1930s color. Well, it was actually turquoise. So I was a little error prone this time, and these are things that I really should know. But that original book is very expensive and very hard to find. Collector's reference books, a lot of people take for granted that because they made so many of them in the 1980s and 90s that there's just lots of spares sitting around everywhere. But some of the early collector's references are actually pretty obscure. If you find the first 1930 to 1953 Blanco reference book, pick it up, because it is definitely really worth having to identify some of these early pieces like this. So this was indeed done in the 1958 to 61 era. It's a beautiful color. I contacted the bidder during the auction to say, I made a mistake or two. I want to make sure that if you don't want this piece, that you understand I will not make you live up to your bid, because I gave you wrong information. And she said, no, I love it. I love the color. I want it. I haven't bought a piece of Blanco before. And she ended up being the winner at $52 on 9 bids, which was a fair price for what it was. So in the end, everything turned out fine. And again, I got schooled a little bit, and that's okay. You know, I think a lot of people think that because I do have a lot of expertise and know a lot about a lot of things, that I know everything about everything, and that is just not possible. And sometimes memories fade. So it really is great that we help each other out. And again, someone else on eBay said, in this case, another viewer said, oh, you've made a couple mistakes in the listing. And I thought, oh, I've got to do something about this. And that's how we handled it. So the person who got it knew exactly what they were getting, and now we all do. This is a great and hard piece to find, and I knew it would do well. They've sold sometimes up as high as $2.25. I got $165.83. I'm not sure how an 83-cent bid comes in on eBay, but somebody made one and they got it on the 16th bid. This is the Howling Cat Ash Receiver, as it was called. Just a little guy about this big, great vibrant blue color from about 1940. And poor kitty, you actually shoved that cigarette down its throat. No wonder it's howling. Poor guy. There it is howling for us, and you can certainly understand why. But it's such a great glaze color, and this is a very hard, very obscure piece to find. It was in excellent condition. There is the Red Wing mark with the mold number 878. This Red Wing with this capital lettering and the sort of long tail on the R that comes down, that's an indication of their very earliest wares that they were doing other than crockery. And this is a 1930s to early 40s piece. And it went to live with a new person. It's just a very cute piece, but I love the vibrance of the glaze in particular. So I was glad that that found its level, and its level was pretty good and in the zone that it should have been. And that's part of the reason that I am not afraid to do auctions. Now, I realize I have a big following now, and because of that, more people are going to find my auctions than maybe the average person on eBay would. But if you have something unusual and you list it correctly and you get it out there, you will have people who will find it and will bid it up if it's a good, unusual piece. When I looked through the bids, most of these bids were not people who I had ever seen before or who knew me, or it was just about the merchandise. And that's why your descriptions are very, very important, and especially your titling. Now, this piece, I thought he was just great. He went for $53. This is Jose Carioca from the Three Caballeros, which was a popular Disney movie. They made this piece. The film came out in the 40s, and they made this piece for about 10 years. They called it Joe Carioca in America, because I guess Jose was a little bit foreign for Americans at that point. We really didn't have great relations with Mexico and Latin America until the 1930s. Things started to look up, and that was the time that we saw a lot of cultural referencing and things like this movie that came out to encourage people to take their Latin American neighbors and the other people in the hemisphere more seriously and be a little less isolated, because it was wartime and we suddenly realized we needed each other. We also realized that Argentina was part of the Axis and had joined forces with Japan and Nazi Germany, and that really opened some eyes, and we thought, boy, we need to do a better job at getting along with the folks in the rest of this hemisphere. So this fellow was definitely, there's a lot of talk now about, Disney and they're pushing culture stuff. Well, that's always been the case, and this is a great example of it. And I think he's really cool. He's really cute. He's very vibrant. and he sold for a good price. Now, the next two items were actually bought by the same customer because this person is a railroad fan, and I wasn't really sure that would happen. I thought we might sell one piece to Canada and one piece to a cat lover. We'll show you that in a minute. But it turned out that they both went to the railroad collector, and this is one good thing to think of if you are listing on eBay. If you're able to find things that cross categories, you have a good likelihood of getting more bids. In this case, the interest is primarily for people who are buying items that relate to railroads. This is the Canadian Pacific passenger car wool blanket from the late 1940s. It's got nice stripes. It's got the Canadian Pacific logo. These were actually sold off at the 1986 Vancouver World's Fair. The theme of the 86 World's Fair was transportation. And so the Canadian Pacific Railroad, part of the reason that it was such a big deal for them was that their old 1910 roundhouse was the only historic building, or one of very few, that was preserved on what became the World's Fair Expo grounds. And so the roundhouse was a big attraction, and that was an opportunity for them to sell off some of this old stuff, which at the time was about 40 years old. Well, now, we've gone on a few more years, and so there's an interest in these, and it went for $58 on 4 bids, which is a pretty reasonable price, but a fair price for what it was. Now, the other piece this collector bought was this set here. This went for $38 on 13 bids. Again, a fair price for what it is. And this is a collection, and there were 2 of each of these, but this is from the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. These were done in the 1950s for the 25th anniversary of the introduction of Chessie the cat. Chessie is the one you see sleeping at the bottom there. And the advertising folks who came up with her in the middle of the Depression, well, the Chesapeake and Ohio had just upgraded a lot of its rail cars, and it was very expensive and at a very, very difficult economic time. So they really wanted to promote that you will sleep well. Our trains are quiet and they're smooth and you're going to have a great experience. And so the kitten sleeping became the logo. Well, the kitten, or the cat sleeping, and that was Chessie. Well, then the kittens came along, because what's cuter than kittens? So then you have Mom with the 2 kittens. But this is in the 1930s and into the early 40s, and all of a sudden people, well, there are some folks who did not really think that was appropriate, because where's Mr. Cat? How does she have kittens if there's no man around? So they had to develop Peek. So Chessie and Peek for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad became their mascots, and here is Peek, and so that's Dad. So she is not a fallen cat. It was definitely a different time when people were much more concerned about that sort of propriety. So there's Peek, Chessie's old man, and I love the fact that they actually called it Chessie's old man. I think they were a little annoyed that they were pushed into having to create a male version, but it worked out, and Peek became popular too. But Chessie is really the star, and there's still a stylized version of Chessie on the side of C&O railway cars today. So this went for $38, and what a cute set. This piece I thought was just great. Now, this is a good example of where something that's very small, if you take a really good picture, can look really horrible in the picture. The truth is, when you're holding this in front of you, you look at it and you think, oh, this is a cute little pencil sharpener made out of metal. And I was actually selling it for a 90-year-old gentleman who had had it since he was a kid. We found it in his desk when he was moving into assisted living, and I was helping him out. And he said, oh yeah, let's sell that thing. So we put it on. It went for $15.50 on 3 bids, which is a good price, I think. Novelty pencil sharpeners are definitely collectible. But the camera, because this is blown up from such a small size, it just makes it look like it is worn to death. And it really was in better condition than that to the naked eye. But it just looks really carved up in these. The person who got it was very pleased, because when you get it in person, it's only about this tall, and all those what seem to be giant paint losses and scratches from normal use actually look like just a nice normal aging when you have it in front of you. So this one sold, and I'm glad that the picture did not Sometimes the pictures that we were talking about, if the picture isn't good enough, sometimes the pictures are too good, and that can be a problem too. The good thing is that usually, if you get your price and you're satisfied with what you got, the person who receives it is delighted because it actually looks much better than they expected. That same person actually bought this piece, and this is the O.J. Simpson Superstar Fun Book from the 1970s. They got it on one bid. I wasn't really sure how OJ would do, but he definitely has a story, and we talked about that story in the video. And boy, he was really popular at the time. He had always wanted to be an actor, and actually, he got the biggest contract in NFL history because he was a very talented player. And when he was signed by the Buffalo Bills, he asked for the biggest contract in the history of the NFL up to that point. And they balked, and he said, "Fine, then I'm going to go become an actor." And they found out that he'd actually studied acting and was serious about that. And they said, "Okay, we'll give you your contract," because they realized that he was serious. He would have just walked or run away. Of course, we saw him run away later in life, and he went from a hero to someone who was infamous and notorious, and that's why his things are collectible now. So that went for $9.99, and that's certainly a fair price for what it was. This piece I really liked. I was so glad it did sell on one bid at the opening bid price. It went to a person in the Atlanta area, as I thought it might, and I debated whether this was the right place to put this, but I thought, I just think that this will reach people in that area. Sometimes with regional items, you may do better if you can find other ways to promote it in the region, or someone to carry a piece for you, like an art store or something. But I had looked into Jean Laysal's. She was well known in the area, and the Peachtree Run is so specific to there. I thought, somebody's going to pick this up, and they did. And the great thing is that actually this one did go to a viewer who is a friend of mine, and even though we certainly could have shipped it, I decided that because I'm driving right by there, I am just going to deliver it so we don't have to ship this thing this big with a huge piece of glass in it. So, sometimes things just work out that way. And that saved her $55 in shipping. So she ended up getting it for $79 even. And that's a great deal for what this is, because honestly, the price with the shipping at about $130 is about where they typically sell. So she got a good deal. I get to say hello, and we know it will get there in one piece. This is the piece that actually went where Lesbian Dates was supposed to go, and vice versa. And the two recipients were very kind to help me out and help fix my mistake. They sent the pieces to each other. Everything got there great. I refunded their shipping because they had to pay to ship to each other. And so I was out the shipping that I did, but that's my fault because I made the mistake in the first place. I'm so glad it worked out. But this is a very cute little Rookwood piece, molded piece with the arches. You see the 1927 in Roman numerals, and 2093 is the mold number. So we know it came out in 1927. I just think that it's such a graceful piece. It was a small little piece, but Rookwood is good quality. It's a pottery company that's long been very collectible. It started in the 1880s. It was a wealthy socialite, and she employed primarily women to make and decorate and design the pottery. In the early days, they did a lot of incredible artware. By this era in the 1920s, like a lot of companies, they're switching over to more molded wares because that's where the market is, and also because the Depression was coming up, and that's why Rookwood was able to stay in business for a long time. It went for just over $100 on 15 bids, which is right about where it should have sold. So I was very pleased. And again, active bidding from a lot of people, and a lot of people who are outside of my sphere of customers. So it was nice to have something that would attract people from across eBay to bid. This piece, I said I had something I was still working on shipping, and I am... there's a reason for it. It's actually sitting here next to me. It's going to the post office. It's a wonderful piece. It's a Dutch Boy paint Showroom Lamp Advertising Premium. There you can see it with the shade on. The shade turned out to be a little bit of trouble. I had imagined that I was going to be shipping them in separate boxes, which I am. And it is the original shade, but you notice it has a weave around it. Well, this weave was done with a in the 1950s when this was made, with a very thin cord. And this cord, over the years, because this was in Florida and it was in a room that was not always well climate controlled, well, unbeknownst to me, the cords started to rot. It's a simple lanyard. They're easy to reweave as long as you don't break any of the holes if something should happen to it. Well, what happened to it was I sold the piece, I put it in the box, and literally setting it in the box was enough after all these years in a different climate, because I'm in Kentucky with this piece now, and it's a different kind of humidity and whatever it was. Just setting it down, the bail, the wire that holds the thing on the lamp, just fell through, and all of that cording on the top just disintegrated. So I had to contact the customer and say, do you still want the piece? I am willing to go get an appropriate lanyard, which will be leather this time, and restitch that top so that it will be correct for you. And she said that would be acceptable to her because the shades are so hard to get. Well, it took me a little while to find the right color of cord. I've just gotten it done, and it will be going in the mail. So this one ended up being a little bit complicated, but it's a great piece, and she still got it for a really good price. Now, a lot of shipping costs, but again, this piece can sell for over $200 in the right guys. I'm glad under the circumstances that it only sold for about $100, because that means that with the repair and everything, and with the fact that I am going to be able to ship it to her in 2 separate boxes, it's a more fair deal for her under the circumstances. But it's a great piece, and I'm glad that it's going to a new home. Ironically, back to Florida. This piece was just so much fun. It sold for $19.50 on 9 bids. I'm not surprised. I thought it might go that high because it's one of the more unusual Valentines from the 1920s that I've seen. In fancy, I can picture you saying yes to this plea of mine, so keep cool and answer right away that you'll be my Valentine. And then it has a miniature metal fan at the bottom. Really cool piece. I haven't seen this particular one anywhere else. I'm sure very few of them survived because this heavy fan would have bent and broken the cardboard if you picked it up wrong. So I was very, very careful with it. There it is from the back. You can see how it's attached with just one little string. And it's just neat as can be. The fan blades do turn. It's a great little piece, and I was very happy that it went to somebody who loves Valentines, or perhaps they collect fans. Again, cross-collectible is good with the online sales. Now, there were 2 items that did not end up, well, I shouldn't say they didn't sell, because they actually sold. Every single item did sell. One of them I listed was a very fancy Buckingham tobacco tin, and they can sell anywhere from $200 to $300, and it was beautiful, and it had great graphics. And I made the mistake of mentioning that it was full of the original tobacco because I thought that would show that it was mint and new and in incredible condition, even though it was 120 years old. And eBay said, oh, no, you cannot sell tobacco. Well, I see their point. Now, I can't imagine that some underage person is going to buy 120-year tobacco because they're that desperate for a smoke, but I get that eBay has to follow what is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms laws, and that they can't let us just sell tobacco if we don't have a license to do so. And so they took the listing down. However, I'd already had inquiries about it, and I was able to contact those people, and one of them took it, and we sold it for $150, which I thought was a pretty good price. And the other item was a casserole in aluminum that was textured by Don Drum, who's an Ohio artist who's still making those sorts of things in his 80s. It was a really neat looking piece. It sold, it did well. but the buyer was all the way out in Washington State. And unfortunately, eBay wants you to pick how you're going to sell. And I just by reflex said how you're going to ship. And I just reflexively said, oh, I'm going to send it by USPS, not thinking it's heavy and it might be really expensive to go to the West Coast. And generally what happens in those cases is I can just flip it on to UPS or FedEx, and we can get them a much better price. Well, by the time I realized that this order hadn't processed, and I went and looked at it, I realized that the customer is looking at it and saying, I'm going to be paying more to ship this thing than I did to buy it. And so I made the transition, said, hey, I can lower the shipping. I'll send it this way. It'll be reasonable. But before we could even get through the transaction, eBay canceled it because, oh, well, the buyer hasn't paid, so we canceled your transaction for you. Isn't that great? And I'm like, but why is there no way for me to tell you, no, we're working it out? Because the customer could have had it and could have had it for the price that she wanted with a shipping cost that would have been reasonable for what it was. So I was a little bit frustrated with that. That is a lesson to me that when something sells, immediately go in if it's something heavy or the customer is far from you, and make sure that shipping price is realistic and that there isn't another option that you can offer them. Had I offered the other option right away, I think the customer would have had time to complete the sale and the item would be in their hands instead of mine. As it turns out, I'm going out to the Portland Antique Show soon, and the customer is from that part of the country. So if you're out there and you're hearing this and you're disappointed that you didn't get your piece, come see me at the Portland. It is the Rose City Vintage Market. It is going to be the 15th and 16th, Saturday and Sunday of July at Expo Center. It's going to be a bigger show than it's been in the past. It's growing. It's going to have outside dealers. Laura Caldwell from Left Coast Revivals is organizing that. So we'll have a whole lot of fun. And if you are that person who found that piece, I will be bringing it, and I'll be happy to sell it to you for the amount that you bid on it, so we can get that all straightened out. So that is the wrap up. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to all the level 2 and 3 members who make this possible. There will be a new level 2/level 3 early access coming for the June listing for 20 eBay items. So if you're a level 2 or 3 member on my channel, look for that in the notifications. And if you're not, if you see a join box, you can click that and find out about memberships and what the perks are, or you can go to the listing under memberships in the description of any video. Thanks so much for joining me, and we will have more fun as we continue to experiment with our sales on eBay.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help. And we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.